Alright, this is the circulatory system. So, same thing, we've got a respiratory, circulatory, excretory, digestive, many systems. And we've got that blood and oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. So, exchange of materials is that base purpose here. Animals have to exchange material across their cell membranes, usually by diffusion. They either have to get fuels, nutrients, or they take in oxygen, or they give off waste, like carbon dioxide. If you're a one-celled organism, it's easy, but if you're many-celled, it's harder because you're not in contact with your environment. So diffusion doesn't work well for moving across more than one cell barrier. So here's one cell barrier, works pretty easily. And here gets a little crazy, which is why we end up adding a circulatory system. So in circulation, what are the things you need to transport? Nutrients and fuels, that comes from your digestive system. Respiratory gases, that's oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that goes through things like lungs and gills. Intracellular waste, that's waste products from the cells like water, salts. Um, Also protective agents, those need to be transported like white blood cells and antibodies. Also blood clotting agents like platelets. And finally, regulatory molecules like hormones. So in circulatory systems, all animals have a circulatory fluid, which we call blood, tubes, which are the blood vessels. So vessels are tubes, not a single circular object. Those are red blood cells, things like that. And a muscular pump, which is the heart. The heart is what pumps it. It's a muscle that keeps pumping. So we have open and closed circulatory systems. And here's your grasshopper open and your worm closed system. Let's talk about what the difference is. Alright, an open system, you'll find in invertebrates like insects, arthropods, and mollusks. And the structure is that the blood vessels, they open into an internal cavity called a sinus. So it just pours into this open cavity. And there's no separation between blood and the interstitial fluid, that internal fluid that keeps everything, surrounds everything. No separation there. So that's an open system. Just pours right in, no separation. In a closed circulatory system, you'd find that in things like earthworms, squid, octopuses, also in vertebrates, such as humans. Closed system, you get a higher pressure. That blood is confined to vessels, and it's separate from interstitial fluid. So they're two separate things. There's usually one or more hearts, and the large vessels branch out into smaller vessels, and the material diffuses between vessels and the interstitial fluid. So it diffuses between the two, but they're two separate things. Alright, so in a vertebrate, like a human, the circulatory system, the number of heart chambers differ. A human has 4 chambers, but you can have 2 or 3 chambers. So like here we've got gills. This is that oxygenated blood, and this is deoxygenated blood. It's got a vein, then it goes through the atrium, the ventricle, and an artery, and then through the gills, then back to the systemic capillaries, around and around. Here, we've got the circuit where we go up and around and back through. We're gonna keep loop-de-looping. And then in the 4-chamber system, it's a one straight tour. So it goes around in so it's in the heart, then it goes into the lung capillaries, then out of the lung back into the heart, and then out of the heart and back into the system. So this system has a high pressure and a high oxygen giving off to the body, low oxygen to the body, and low pressure to the body. So the 4-chamber heart is a double pump. It separates our oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood and maintains high pressure. So the effects of a 4-chambered heart. Just a few effects of having a 4-chambered heart. So your body size, because you have a 4-chambered heart, it's probably a bigger animal. So there's protection from predation. And they have a bigger body in order to hold the bigger heart. So you'd have to have a bigger stomach if you were an herbivore. And endothermy, they're able to colonize more habitats. They're able to stabilize their temperature. That's what endothermy has to do with. And flight, they can decrease predation and increase prey capture because they might be able to fly, dependent on the animal. There's also an effect of a higher metabolic rate. They need more energy, fuels, oxygen, and waste removal. So that's something that has to be served, and it has to be served with the four-chambered heart. All right, the vertebrate cardiovascular system. We've got our chambered heart. It's got a right chamber and a left chamber. We have atriums and ventricles. In the atrium is where you receive blood, and ventricles are where you pump blood out. And the few different kinds of blood vessels, you have arteries. They carry blood away from the heart. So arteries start with an A, think away. They turn into arterioles, those are smaller arteries. Then veins return blood to the heart, and they're also venules. And capillaries are the point of exchange. They're a thin wall, they're that single cell capillary where you can exchange through diffusion. And capillary beds are networks of capillaries. Alright, so systemic circulation is half the process. Blood flows in a continuous circuit, so you can take a full tour of the body, following it all the way around. As you can see, we've got our right atrium where the blood comes in, our right ventricle, the blood gets pumped out. Our left atrium, blood comes in, and left ventricle, blood gets pumped out. Also, we have our arteries going into arterioles, into capillaries. So, systemic circulation in the beginning. The blood leaves the heart from the left ventricle, and it goes through the aortic semilunar valve. Then it enters the aorta, which is a very large blood vessel, and that aorta branches out into arteries, which are smaller vessels. Eventually those become arterioles and then capillaries, the smallest. You need to know all of this. All right, arteries, they're built for a high pressure pump, so they always take blood away. See, they start with A, think away. They have thicker walls, so they've got the strength for high pressure pumping of blood. They have a narrower diameter, which causes higher pressure, smaller area, and their elasticity, their elastic recoil will keep that blood pressure up even when the heart relaxes. It'll still keep the blood pressure going. So here you go. You can kind of see this double layer of thickness around, so we've got thick walls. Now capillaries are built for exchange. They have very thin walls. They don't have two outer wall layers, just the endothelium. So here's our capillary with just the endothelium. And so you're able to exchange even better. So it gives oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and takes carbon dioxide and waste from the tissues. So here you go. Blood flow. Fluid and solutes flow out of the capillaries due to blood pressure, so the blood's pushing, so it'll push it out. And interstitial fluid flows back into the capillaries due to osmosis. So it'll push its wastes into the capillaries. So deoxygenation. The capillaries gave oxygen to the tissues, so they need more oxygen. So they gave up all their oxygen, they need more. So off we go to the lungs. But before we get to the lungs, we go back to the heart. So from the capillaries, where the blood is deoxygenated, you go to venules and then to veins. And then from the veins, you enter the right atrium, where it's the least oxygenated. And you enter the right atrium through either the superior or inferior vena cava. Then from the right atrium, you go to the right ventricle through the right atrioventricular valve, also known as the tricuspid. And then you go to the lungs, and we hit pulmonary circulation. So systemic circulation is throughout the body, and pulmonary circulation is throughout the lungs. So veins are built for low pressure flow. Veins are thinner walled, they've got a wider diameter, so it provides for lower pressure, and the blood travels back to the heart at a low velocity and pressure. That lower pressure is because it's distant from the heart, and the blood has to flow by skeletal muscle contractions as we move. So we squeeze blood through the veins. So if you're not moving, if your muscles are not contracting, you're going to have bad circulation. So this is blood flow toward the heart. There are these valves in here. Notice this one's closed and this one's open. And the valves are one-way valves. So veins only flow toward the heart. Alright, in pulmonary systems, blood leaves the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve and enters the pulmonary artery, leaving the heart, and it goes off to the lungs. It gets oxygenated and returns via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Then it goes into the left ventricle via the left atrioventricular valve, also the bicuspid or mitral valve. And that's the end of our tour. We've gone our whole circle throughout the body with the blood. Few extra things. The lymphatic system. We have lymph nodes. You can sometimes feel them in your neck as lumps, especially when you're sick. And they transport white blood cells, and so those help defend against infection. So we need those white blood cells to be transported with the blood so that we can fight infections throughout the body. The duties of the lymphatic system: they collect proteins and interstitial fluid and help return it to the bloodstream. So it helps pull it back into the bloodstream, the stuff that gets left out. Alright, we've already talked about our circulation, but you can see here all the different diagrams of how we go through everything. You know, here's your pulmonary vein, pulmonary artery, the anterior vena cava, capillaries, left ventricle, the aorta, so on and so forth. Blue is, it has almost no oxygen, it's deoxygenated, and red is oxygenated. And that's your mammalian heart. So we talked about the semilunar valve, the atrioventricular valve. So you can go back and look at that. Alright, so heart sounds. What's the sound that your heart makes when you go to the doctor? That's the closing of valves. Those valves are closed off. The lub is the recoil of blood against those closed valves. The atrioventricular valves, and the dub is the recoil of blood against the semilunar valves. And a heart murmur is something where there's a defect in the valves that causes a hissing sound as blood is squirting backward through the valve. Alright, so your cardiac cycle, one complete sequence of pumping. The heart contracts and pumps 72 times a minute. So the heart relaxes, chambers fill up, and then it contracts, and that's called systole, and that's where the ventricles pump blood out. And then the relaxation phase, diastole, is when the atrium refill with blood. So systolic is pumping, diastolic is filling. So low pressure at fill, high pressure at pumping. So blood pressure, measuring blood pressure, this is how the cuffs work, you can kind of see it. High blood pressure is called hypertension. And so it's either from systolic pumping or some sort of diastolic filling, but high blood pressure will give you hypertension, which is not good. Another one to know is arteriosclerosis. That's when your arteries harden, and so they're not flexible anymore. They're not elastic anymore, so that increases the risk of death by embolism, which is when a piece of tissue might break off and get stuck in an artery and block blood flow. Alright, finally, what is blood made of? It's mostly water, and it's also got plasma in it, which contains minerals, hormones, antibodies, nutrients. There's also platelets, which help with the clotting of blood. They're just cell fragments. And then red blood cells, they have a lot of hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin is what allows them to carry oxygen. And then white blood cells help fight infections. All blood cells are made in bone marrow. That's a fun fact you need to know for the AP test. All blood cells are made in bone marrow. So that's the end of the circulatory system lecture.